Are you ready to learn the truth about what life was like in one of the greatest civilizations of the past? Imagine a world where the sun doesn't just shine, but melts away your very will to resist. There are none of the comforts we are used to, no air conditioning or the saving shade of skyscrapers. Every day is an endless struggle against the merciless elements, hunger, and invisible enemies lurking in the water and air. Ancient Egypt, which we are used to seeing in colorful pictures in textbooks, was in reality a harsh testing ground for survival. The majestic pyramids and golden masts of the Pharaohs hide thousands of stories of ordinary people overcoming unimaginable difficulties. Here, time flows differently, obeying not the hands of the clock, but the floods of the great river and the movement of the heavenly body. The average person here is just a grain of sand in the huge machine of the state, dependent on the harvest and the mercy of the gods. Survival in these conditions required not only physical strength. We invite you to immerse yourself in the atmosphere of antiquity and try on the role of a resident of the Nile Valley. This journey will change your perception of comfort and safety. Watch the video to the end. What if I told you that everything you believed in was untrue, and that the romance of antiquity was shattered by the harsh realities of everyday life? Your survival in ancient Egypt begins not with the search for food, but with the realization of the sun's total power over your body. Ra is not just a god on a fresco. He is a ruthless physical force that determines your every step. Here the day begins long before dawn, when the air still retains the coolness of the night. With the first rays of the sun, the world around you turns into a scorching oven, where the stones heat up to a temperature that can burn your skin. Shadows practically disappear, and hiding from the scorching heat becomes the main task for preserving your sanity. Coarse linen clothing does not save you, but only slightly softens the blow of the sun's rays. You will have to learn to move slowly, saving every movement and every drop of moisture in your body. Working in the fields or on construction sites requires superhuman endurance in conditions where the air shimmers with heat. Farmers and workers are forced to labor, drenched in sweat that evaporates instantly, leaving a layer of salt on their skin. Dehydration creeps up on you, and the first sign is not thirst, but fogginess and weakness. At noon, life comes to a standstill, as being outdoors becomes deadly dangerous for anyone. People seek shelter in mud houses or under palm leaf awnings. This is a time of forced idleness. However, even in the shade, the temperature remains extremely high, preventing the body from fully resting. The walls of the houses, heated during the morning, begin to give off heat inside the rooms. The absence of wind makes the air thick and heavy. Towards evening, when the heat subsides a little, work resumes with renewed vigor. It is necessary to finish all tasks before complete darkness falls, which descends on the valley instantly. Night brings relief, but it also harbors dangers in the form of sharp temperature changes. In the desert, the cold comes as quickly as the heat of the day. You will have to find a way to keep warm using the same linen fabrics that protected you from overheating during the day. The sleep of the inhabitants of ancient Egypt is light and short, because tomorrow everything will happen again. This endless cycle of exhausting heat and hard labor shapes a special type of character. People here learn patience and humility in the face of forces of nature that cannot be controlled. Survival depends on the ability to adapt to the rhythm of the sun rather than trying to fight it. Any mistake, whether it be an extra hour of work at noon or a lack of water, can be fatal. There is no place for heroism in the modern sense here, only a pragmatic calculation of strength. We would be very interested to hear your thoughts on this daily routine. What do you think? Could you work in this way without modern conveniences? Write your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories about survival. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the Egyptians looked the way they did? Their famous appearance was not a tribute to fashion, but a harsh necessity for survival in unsanitary conditions. Heat and dust create the perfect environment for bacteria and parasites to multiply on the human body. In such a climate, hair becomes not an adornment, but a real problem and a source of disease. That is why thorough shaving of the head and body was a mandatory procedure for most of the population concerned about their health. It was the only reliable way to get rid of uninvited guests living in the hair. Smooth skin is easier to wash, dries faster. Instead of hair, the Egyptians wore wigs, which served as headgear to protect against sunstroke. Wigs could be removed, cleaned, and aired out, which was impossible to do with one's own hair. It was an ingenious solution that combined aesthetics and practicality. Skincare was no less important than hair removal, as dry skin cracked and became a gateway for infections. Various oils and fats were used for protection, creating a protective film on the body. These products helped retain moisture. The famous black eyeliner that we see in ancient frescoes also had a medical purpose. The lead and mineral-based composition protected the eyes from the bright sun and repelled small insects. It was an ancient analog of sunglasses and antiseptic at the same time. Bathing in the river was a daily ritual, but it harbored many hidden dangers. The life-giving waters of the Nile were also full of dangers, from predators to microscopic parasites. Therefore, people tried to wash in specially designated areas or using water from jugs that had been left to settle. White linen clothing was washed with maniacal thoroughness, despite the difficulty of the process. Dirty fabric in the heat quickly became a breeding ground for disease and caused skin diseases. Washerwomen worked on the riverbank, beating the fabric against stones to achieve perfect cleanliness. The smell of sweat was considered a sign of uncleanliness and low status, so natural deodorants were used. Aromatic resins and herbs were rubbed into the skin to mask the effects of the heat. Cleanliness of the body was equated with cleanliness of the soul and was necessary for access to temples. So the beauty of the ancient Egyptians was literally earned through struggle against a harsh environment. It was a daily effort to improve oneself, necessary simply to stay alive. Guess how long it took to create this unique survival menu? Food in ancient Egypt was far from modern ideas of gastronomic diversity. The staple diet was bread and beer. Due to the nature of grinding grain into flour, tiny stone chips and desert sand inevitably found their way into it. With every meal, this abrasive component mercilessly wore down the teeth of the inhabitants of the Nile Valley. By adulthood, many Egyptians suffered from serious dental problems. The second most important product was beer, which was more like a nutritious porridge in consistency. It was not an alcoholic beverage for fun, but a way to disinfect water and obtain calories. The fermentation process killed most dangerous bacteria, making the liquid safe to drink. Everyone drank beer, from simple pyramid builders to high-ranking officials, and it was part of the daily ration. It was a source of energy necessary for hard physical labor under the scorching sun. Refusal to drink it could mean drinking raw water, which carried the risk of dysentery. Vegetables and fruits were available, but preserving them in a hot climate was a huge problem. Onions, garlic, and legumes formed the basis of the vitamin intake of the common man. They were also valued for their antiseptic properties. Meat rarely appeared on the table of an ordinary Egyptian, mainly on major holidays. The main source of animal protein was fish. Sweets were replaced by dates and honey, which were not available to everyone. Honey was valued as much as gold, not only as a delicacy, but also as a medicine. Most people were content with simple and monotonous food that gave them the strength to live until the next day. Hunger was a real threat, especially between harvests. The ability to distribute scarce food supplies correctly was an essential survival skill. People got used to being content with little, never knowing the feeling of complete satiety. This diet, despite its simplicity, allowed civilization to exist and build grandiose structures. It was perfectly adapted to local conditions and resources, although it had its side effects. If you were surprised by the fact about sand in bread, want to know a secret that will change your life and your perception of water? The Nile is not just a river on a map. It is the lifeblood of an entire civilization, giving life and taking it away. All life is concentrated on a narrow strip of fertile land along the banks, beyond which lies a barren desert.
Will the banks hold, or will we lose everything?
We have secured what we can, but the river is strong.
More bags, quickly!
The annual flooding of the Nile was the most anticipated and at the same time alarming event for every inhabitant. Too low a water level meant drought and crop failure, condemning thousands to starvation. Too high a level threatened to destroy homes, wash away dams, and destroy settlements. Life in the river floodplain meant constant readiness to fight the elements and mud. After the water receded, the fields turned into a swamp of silt, in which people had to work knee-deep. This fertile silt was the key to a good harvest, but working in it was hellishly hard. The river was the main transport artery connecting scattered settlements into a single country. Traveling by water was faster and safer than traveling across the hot sands of the desert. The ability to steer a boat was as important a skill as the ability to wield a hoe. However, the water concealed deadly dangers beneath its murky surface. Crocodiles and hippopotamuses were a real threat to fishermen and women washing clothes. Caution near the water was instilled from birth, as any careless step. In addition to large predators, invisible enemies lived in the water, parasites that penetrated the skin. Bilharzia and other waterborne diseases slowly killed the body from within. People fell ill, grew weak, and died, often without even understanding the true cause of their illness. A complex system of canals and dams was created to irrigate the fields, requiring constant maintenance. Every peasant was obliged to participate in public works to maintain this system. Shirking this duty was severely punished, as it threatened the survival of the entire community. Housing in ancient Egypt was built not for beauty, but for protection from the scorching sun. The main building material was unfired mud bricks made from a mixture of Nile silt and straw. This material was cheap, readily available, and had excellent thermal insulation properties. The thick walls heated slowly during the day and gave off heat during the cold night. Inside such a house, it was always dim, as the windows were small and located near the ceiling. This minimized the amount of direct sunlight entering the room. The roof of the house was flat and served as an additional living room for the whole family. On hot nights, mats were spread out on the roof to sleep on, escaping the stuffiness of the interior. Here, too, food was dried, meals were prepared. The interior of the house was ascetic and purely functional, without unnecessary items. There was little furniture, low stools, chests for belongings, and woven mats on the clay floor. Beds were a luxury not available to everyone. Most people slept on clay platforms. Instead of soft pillows, the Egyptians used hard headrests made of wood or stone. This device supported the head, allowing air to circulate around the neck and preserving elaborate hairstyles. Sleeping on such a device was uncomfortable at first. The kitchen was often moved to the courtyard or roof so that smoke and heat from the hearth did not enter the house. Food was cooked in clay ovens using dried manure or reeds as fuel. Wood was in short supply and was saved for more important purposes. Sanitary facilities in simple houses were practically non-existent, which created additional problems. Waste was often poured into drainage ditches or directly onto the street, exacerbating unsanitary conditions. Combating unpleasant odors and insects in the house was a constant concern for the housewife. Rodents and snakes were frequent visitors to clay dwellings, entering through cracks in the walls. To protect themselves from them, the Egyptians kept cats, which were revered as sacred animals and protectors of the home.
This fruit is
The
really
presence of
good.
cats was not a
Are
whim,
we having stew
but a matter of
tonight?
security
Yes,
for grain
almost
supplies
ready.
and the health of the inhabitants.
Spirit of the stone, mend this.
What if
broken
everything you were
vessel?
taught is outdated and real medicine looked completely different?
It will keep
In
the
a world
sickness
without
away.
microscopes and antibiotics,
Rest now.
diseases were perceived as punishment from the gods or the machinations of evil spirits. A healer in ancient Egypt was simultaneously a doctor, a priest, and a magician. Treatment combined entirely rational methods with spells and amulets, which were believed in unquestioningly. Eye infections were a real scourge due to the constant sand, dust, and bright sun. Blindness was common, and complex ointments were used to combat it. They contained honey, ochre, and various plant components, which were applied to the inflamed eyelid. Wounds and cuts sustained at work were treated with honey, which is a natural antiseptic. Moldy bread was also used, applied to the wound, a precursor to penicillin thousands of years before its discovery. This helped prevent gangrene and accelerated tissue healing. However, serious internal diseases often stumped ancient doctors. Diagnosis was based on examination, pulse palpation, and observation of bodily secretions. If the cause of the disease was unclear,
These are not mere ornaments, my
everyone
child.
from young to old
They
wore
are our
amulets,
shield against
believing
the
in their
darkness
protective
and
power
illness.
against disease and misfortune. The Eye of Horus, the Scarab, and the Knot of Isis were not just decorations, but essential medical equipment. The loss of an amulet was perceived as a catastrophe, leaving a person defenseless against invisible enemies. Surgery was developed to a surprisingly high level for that time, especially in the treatment of fractures. Doctors knew how to apply splints made of bark and fabric, set dislocations, and even perform trepanation of the skull. Bronze and obsidian instruments were sharp, but sterility remained an unattainable dream. Pain relief was primitive, mainly using opium or large amounts of beer. Patients had to endure the pain, relying on the skill of the doctor and their own endurance. Survival after serious operations depended on immunity
May the breath
and the will of the
Ra
gods.
fill you.
Belief
May
in
the
the
magic
effectiveness
of
of treatment
Horus
played a
protect
huge
you.
role in the patient's recovery. Psychosomatics worked at full power. If a person believed in the power of a spell, it became easier for them. How do you feel about the combination of medicine and non-traditional methods of treatment? Ancient Egyptian society was permeated by a strict hierarchy, where everyone knew their place. At the top of the pyramid of power
Another
was not only the
shortage in your
pharaoh,
tally.
but also an
This
army of
negligence
officials
will
and
not be
scribes.
overlooked.
For the common man, meeting a scribe was an event that caused trepidation and fear for his future. Scribes kept records of everything, from the amount of grain in the granaries to every goose on a peasant's farm. It was practically impossible to hide anything from the all-seeing eye of the state. Taxes were a heavy burden on farmers and artisans. They had to give a significant portion of their harvest or production
20
to
measures
the
of
pharaoh's
grain.
treasury and temples.
We will pay what we must.
Crop failure or disease were no excuse.
those stones
The
or
debt
taste
to the
the
state
lash.
had to be paid at any cost. The penalties for non-payment or attempted fraud
Pharaoh's granary
were severe and
must be
inevitable.
filled. Since
A
you have
person
failed
could
in your
lose their
duty, your
property,
harvest is
freedom,
seized,
or
and you
even
owe
be
3
sent to
months'
hard
labor
labor in
to
the
state.
quarries. Fear of punishment was the main incentive to obey the laws and rules. Education was the key to
About the
social
Pharaoh's
mobility,
decree.
but few had access to
Pharaoh
it.
commands
Becoming a
that
scribe
the
meant
grain
escaping
be
hard
stored in
physical
the
labor
granary.
and securing a comfortable life. Parents dreamed of their sons learning to read and write and joining the managerial caste. The common people were effectively tied to the land and to their duties to their lord. Freedom of movement was restricted, and special permits were required for travel. Individuals were cogs in a huge system working for the glory of the state. The judicial system was also controlled by officials and priests who settled disputes.
Temple's claim is
Justice
upheld.
often
The
depended on
harvest
status
belongs
and
to the
connections
gods.
rather than truth. It was difficult for ordinary people to defend their rights in the face of those in power. Imagine a world without coins, banknotes, or credit cards. The economy of ancient Egypt was based on barter and a complex system of equivalence. To get what you needed, you had to have something valuable to exchange: grain, oil, cloth, or handicrafts. The market was the center of social life, a noisy and colorful place where destinies were decided. Here you could exchange surplus crops for fish, sandals, or a new tool. The ability to bargain was a vital skill, without which you could be left with nothing. There was a universal unit of measurement of value, the daben, the weight equivalent of copper or silver. Goods were valued in dabens, although the pieces of metal themselves rarely changed hands. It was a virtual currency that allowed one to compare the value of a sack of grain and a pair of geese. Grain was the most stable and reliable currency used to pay for work and goods. Barns served as banks where the wealth of families and the state was stored. Inflation was reflected in poor harvests when the cost of grain skyrocketed. Craftsmen exchanged their products for food, providing for themselves and their families. Potters, weavers, and blacksmiths depended on the demand for their goods in the local market. The quality of their work directly affected the craftsman's ability to feed himself. Foreign trade was controlled by the state and was the business of the pharaoh and his entourage. Cedar, incense, gold, and rare stones were brought from distant countries. These goods were inaccessible to the common people and were used for the needs of the palace and temples. Debt was common, and it was very easy to fall into debt. People borrowed grain until the new harvest, often at high interest rates. Failure to repay a debt could lead to the loss of property or even personal freedom. Social connections and reputation played a huge role in economic relations. Honest people were more likely to be given loans and offered better exchange rates. Cheating in the market could permanently ruin one's reputation and close off access to resources. Clothing in ancient Egypt was not just a way to cover nakedness, but an important tool for thermoregulation. The main material was linen, which was grown, processed, and woven in huge quantities. Linen fabric was ideal for hot climates. Men most often wore a shentus, a simple loincloth made from a piece of white fabric. It did not restrict movement during work and provided minimal protection. A person's status could be determined by the quality of the fabric. Women wore kalaziris, long, narrow dresses with straps that fit snugly around the figure. They were also made of linen and could be complemented with a cape or cloak in cooler weather. The simplicity of the cut was compensated for by decorations and the quality of the bleached fabric. Shoes were a luxury item, and most people walked barefoot on the hot ground. Sandals woven from papyrus or leather were worn only by wealthy people or on special occasions. The soles of the feet became rough and insensitive to the hot sand and stones. Jewelry was worn by everyone, regardless of gender or social status, in the belief that it had magical powers. Necklaces, bracelets, and rings served as amulets to ward off evil spirits. The materials ranged from simple faience and bone. Washing clothes was hard physical labor, which was done by professional male laundresses. The fabric not only had to be washed in the river, but also bleached in the sun. The whiteness of clothing was a symbol of purity and status that everyone aspired to. On cool nights or in winter, woolen cloaks were used, although wool was considered unclean. It was never worn in temples or at sacred ceremonies. It was purely practical clothing for protection from the cold, which was kept separately. Death in ancient Egypt was not seen as the end, but rather as a transition to a new stage of existence. A person's entire life was, in essence, a long and careful preparation for this transition. Survival in this world only made sense in the context of securing a worthy place in the next world. Preparation for the afterlife began long before old age, as soon as the means were available. The construction of a tomb, even the most modest one, was the main investment in the future. People set aside resources to ensure the preservation of their bodies and names after death. The concept of Mat, universal harmony and truth, regulated human behavior during life. To pass the judgment of Osiris, one had to live honestly, not break the laws, and not anger the gods. Fear of the afterlife judgment was a powerful moral regulator of society. Mummification, albeit in a simplified form, was a desirable procedure for every Egyptian. Preserving the body was considered a necessary condition for the return of the Ka soul. The poor, who could not afford embalming, hoped for natural preservation in the dry sands of the desert. The cult of the dead required regular offerings and prayers from living relatives. Having many children, especially sons, was important for preserving the memory of ancestors. If there was no one to bring water and bread to the tomb, the world of the dead was imagined as an idealized copy of the world of the living, only without disease and grief. The fields of Yalu were a place of eternal abundance, where bread grew by itself and the Nile was always full. This hope helped people endure the hardships of earthly existence with patience. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions, was a guide to the dangerous afterlife. Knowing the right words and rituals was as important as living a righteous life. Even ordinary people tried to memorize the basic formulas. We have seen that life in ancient Egypt was far from a fairy tale idyll. It was a harsh school of survival, where every day challenged human endurance. From the scorching sun to the dangerous waters of the Nile, from disease to hard labor. But it was these difficulties that gave rise to a great culture that still amazes us today. The Egyptians learned to live in harmony with the harsh natural environment, to find joy in small things, and to believe in eternity. Their experience reminds us that humans are capable of adapting to any conditions if they have a goal and faith. Write in the comments what other historical eras you would like to explore from the point of view of survival. Perhaps you are interested in medieval Europe or the life of the Vikings? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue our journey through time.